Okay, hello and welcome to Introduction to Cognitive Science. Today we're going to be talking about crime and punishment and how these relate to cognitive science. This is the second to last lecture for this class. Next time we'll be talking about religious belief and how what cognitive science has to say about that. Okay, so an outline for today. Today basically we're going to do four things. We're going to be first of all talking about brain differences and how these relate to our punishment practices, how we punish criminals. We're then going to talk about psychopaths, and they're going to be like our clear example of a way in which brain differences can lead people to commit crimes. And then we're going to talk about some of the law's assumptions, some of the assumptions that the legal system in this country and other countries make. And then finally, we'll talk about Eagleman's proposals for revising justice and policing and some other kinds of aspects of our legal system. And we'll talk about whether those proposals seem to be too much or if they're in fact not enough. Okay, so that's our goal for today. So the reading that you're going to look at by Eagleman, there are two pieces that support this lecture. So one is a reading by a neuroscientist, David Eagleman, and then the other is a episode from the podcast Radiolab. So those are the two things you need to look at for this lecture. In the reading, Eagleman discusses many, many different instances of ways in which brain differences or brain damage can impact someone's action in criminal cases. And one of these is the case of Charles Whitman, who was the Texas University tower shooter. So Charles Whitman fatally shot 3 people inside the university tower when he stormed it in the 1960s. And then he went to the tower's 28th floor, its observation deck, where he fired at random people for about 96 minutes, killing an additional 11 people, including an unborn child, and wounding 31 others before he was shot dead by Austin police officers. When police went to the house, they also discovered that Whitman had killed his wife and his mom, right? Whitman himself had killed a total of 17 people. The 17th victim died 35 years later from injuries sustained in the attack. So what was going on with Charles Whitman? Well, Whitman had left a suicide note, as Eagleman discusses, in which, he was shot by officers, so he didn't, actually commit suicide in some sense, but he left a note in which he had said that he had had these kinds of mental problems, ever worsening mental problems developing for the past several years. And he had visited doctors, but they had dismissed his complaints, said there wasn't really anything to do for him, and he had requested an autopsy of his brain after he died. And so this autopsy was performed, and it was found that Whitman was suffering from a tumor, a glioblastoma that affected the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the amygdala. 3 areas deep in the brain. They're identified here on this graph. So you can see the arrow over to the right is pointing to the thalamus. The 2 on the left are pointing to the hypothalamus and the amygdala. And these areas are involved in emotion regulation, and particularly regulation of fear and aggression. So it stands to reason that Whitman was affected by this tumor and that this in some way led to his criminal act, that he wouldn't have committed this act if not for the presence of this brain disorder. So a question that arises here relates to brain disorders and crime. It seems that in addition to this kind of tumor and this unusual and sensational case of the Texas tower shooter, that brain disorders and biological differences often lead people to transgress and commit crimes. So the Texas shooter is one example, as I mentioned. But in the article, there is a pedophile, Alex, who's discussed in some detail, also suffering from a particular abnormal brain development. And then also in the podcast, another example of this, maybe the same person, in fact, Kevin, is discussed. So these are 2 examples in which it seems like a tumor can lead someone to develop pedophilic inclinations and not behave as themselves in some way, indeed to commit crimes. Additionally, the article discusses the way in which frontotemporal dementia, which impacts many people in old age, can lead to impulse control, so that people gamble too much or make unwise contributions to potential charities that might bilk them out of money, or make foolish purchases. All of these can be associated with frontotemporal dementia, and sometimes people overdraw their credit cards in these cases and are held responsible for these things. In addition, in these cases of frontotemporal dementia cases, as the article discusses, it can lead to sexual assaults in some cases. And then additionally, we know that Parkinson's treatment can lead to gambling and hypersexuality. These two are discussed in the article. So in all these cases, it seems like brain disorders. Oh, and then finally, one last example is the example of Kenneth Parkes, the sleepwalking killer. And you'll see this is discussed in the article as well. But in all of these cases, it seems that like brain disorders and biological differences can lead us to transgress and commit crimes. And so the question that the article essentially raises is, well, to what degree should this be a mitigating factor in punishment for those crimes? To what degree should we take into account the disordered nature of the brain or biological differences that might have led to these crimes? Now, I think one thing that is telling here is, or one question that's really interesting here, if we start thinking about this as like brain disorders leading to a mitigation of punishment, well, we might worry that we face a kind of slippery slope, right? So first of all, just notice that the notion of disorder is unclear. What counts as a disorder is in part a value-driven choice, and it can change, right? It's also pretty clear that our minds are our brains, or at least are very closely related to our brains. And so in the case of any criminal act, there are undoubtedly many biological brain differences that influence that action, right? Surely if someone, behaves in this antisocial way where the rest of us don't, there must be some underlying brain explanation for that action, right? For example, we know that many prisoners, most of the people in prisons, have poor impulse control, right? And indeed, because of this, they no doubt have attendant differences in prefrontal cortical regions associated with impulse control. And so a question naturally arises, well, I mean, maybe it's not only the people who have these like diagnosed disorders in some way, right? People who have tumors growing in their brain that lead them to act violently or hypersexually, or people who are suffering from certain other disorders that cause them to act in certain antisocial ways. It's not only those people that we need to be talking about as far as like their brain state mitigating their action, but in fact, we might think that, just instead of giving certain criminals a break for brain disorders, we should just abandon the idea of criminal responsibility altogether, right? At least this is a kind of slippery slope argument that one might make if they were worried about taking into account taking into account for mitigating purposes the brain disorder that someone has. So this is a thought. Generally, so when you're reading through these two things, when you're thinking about this, I want you to think about these big questions and like, to what extent we should take, we should take brain differences into account in assessing moral responsibility and punishing people. But I want to just give you one other example of a clear case, I think, in which there must be something going on with an individual's brain, right? So in a certain sense, it's kind of a dispositional view of evil. Just another case of a class of criminals that clearly must have some sort of biological difference. Okay, And so the example I'm going to use is a psychopath. So first question is, what is a psychopath? Well, this condition was first recognized in the early 1800s. Um, and when it was noticed that there are people who essentially aren't what they would have considered mad at the time, but had a kind of social disdain for others in society. They didn't care about other people in society. So this is when this difference was first noticed. Within the literature itself, you come across people who use the concept psychopath and people who use the concept sociopath. It has been suggested that in one of these cases, the difference between these two concepts is in terms of being understood as one being naturally caused or caused by some kind of inborn brain disorder. That would be psychopathy. And the other, sociopathy, has been understood as arising through life experience in some way, or perhaps damages arising in life. In fact, this distinction isn't really honored. And really what's going on here, I think, when people use these other concepts, sociopath as opposed to psychopath, is it's just a different name for this thing. And I think that, I mean, like essentially those two concepts have the same reference if you look at how they're used in the literature. But I think that psychopath is used more often and is the more common concept to be used here. Neither of these concepts, though, appear in the DSM-4 or the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is essentially the collection of recognized disorders by the American Psychological Association. So in the DSM-4, what instead is referenced is antisocial personality disorder. And so we can talk about that as distinct from this concept of psychopath. People who've studied this have actually offered a kind of psychopath checklist, a set of questions that can allow us to identify people who are psychopaths. And I invite you to look that up. It includes things like increased promiscuity, braggadocio, superficial charmingness, right? Like, so all of these are like traits that are associated with psychopathy and that can be used to diagnose if someone's a psychopath or not. I forget how many questions there are on it or what the breaking point is, but there's a certain point on the psychopath checklist where if you answer a certain amount of questions, or if a certain amount of questions get answered about you in the affirmative, then you are considered a psychopath. So that's what we're talking about. But it's a little bit of a strange concept because it may be different parts of it that are present in one person as compared to another. In popular culture, psychopaths have often been portrayed. So this is the guy from No Country for Old Men. I think that this is a really brilliant portrayal of a psychopath in this movie, and I invite you to check it out. But essentially, like, the kinds of characteristics that occur on this checklist are things that we recognize in these portrayals. So, for example, lack of concern for the feelings of others, a kind of lack of emotions, shallow emotions. Psychopaths externalize blame, so it's always someone else's fault when they make a mistake and not their own fault. They're known for insincere speech, for saying things they don't really believe. They have a kind of overconfidence. They believe in themselves too much. They're selfish. They care about themselves more than others. And they also have an inability to plan for the future. So all of these are characteristics that are indicative of psychopathy. These all occur on the psychopath checklist, but there are more as well. And then also being due to violence. Okay, so however psychopathy is caused, it must be due in some way to some underlying brain difference. But there are, in fact, two different explanations for why psychopathy, why psychopaths are the way they are. One is what's called an attentional bottleneck. So attentional bottleneck. So according to this explanation, something is going on in the psychopath's brain with attention. They're unable to attend to some relevant facts. And we'll talk about this in a second. And then another thing that people emphasize is, sort of unsurprisingly, that they have a kind of emotional impairment. So psychopaths, emotionality is impaired in some way that causes them to act in the violent and thoughtless ways in which they do. So let's talk about the attentional bottleneck first. So the problem psychopaths face in trying to go about performing different decisions in different cases, according to this kind of theory of attentional bottleneck, the problem is that is a problem with relocating or reallocating attention to secondary information when engaged in goal-directed behavior. So the thought of this view is the reason that these psychopaths behave in evil ways, harmful ways to other people, intentionally harm other people, is that they can't reallocate attention to secondary information, again, when they're engaged in some goal-directed behavior, right? So the idea is this, like if they're performing some action, like think about performing an action like driving a car, or I don't know, trying to buy something at a convenience store, or trying to make some money so that you can buy something. When they face these issues, right, they're focused on this particular goal, like trying to get some money, trying to buy something at a convenience store, so on, and they just fail to notice certain stimuli in the background. They perceive those stimuli, but they don't attend to them in the appropriate way, right? Their brains are so focused on the goal that they're aimed at, the goal-directed stimuli, that they fail to notice effective information unless it's a central aspect of their goal-directed focus of attention, okay? So if it's not relevant to the goal, then they just fail to notice it. So this is a kind of idea of what's going on in the case of the psychopath. They have this kind of attentional bottleneck where when they're focused on a goal, they ignore background information. So here's an illustration of this. A few years ago, this guy came out here to speak. So this is a philosopher and a cognitive scientist at Duke University. His name is Walter Armstrong, so you can look him up if you want to see something about him. And he's done a lot of work on the nature of psychopathy with psychologists. And he told the story about this psychopath that one of his research associates was studying, and what landed that psychopath in jail. Of course, psychopath studies are often conducted on psychopaths who are in the criminal community because they commit a lot of crime. So this is a nice illustration of the attitudinal bottleneck, I think, if this is actually going on, or the attentional bottleneck. So this psychopath went drinking with his buddies a lot. He was, would always go hang out with them. But he always just showed up without any beer, and he would drink their beer, and they were getting really sick of it. So they were like, okay, you're welcome to come out and hang out, but you've got to bring something to the party next time. So on the next, the next time he's going over there, he stops by a convenience store and he picks up like a case of Corona or something. Okay. And he walks up to the cashier and he goes to pay, and he reaches his wallet and he realizes, damn it, he left his wallet at home. Okay. So what does he do instead? Well, he doesn't want to go back home and get the wallet. So instead of paying for the beer, he beats the clerk to death and takes the beer and goes to his friend's house and hangs out. So this is a nice illustration of this. You can imagine the clerk who is horrified by what's going on to them, like begging, pleading for their lives. But because this person is so focused on this goal of getting the beer, getting to the party, he totally ignores this external information that is not associated with the goal. The external information here is the clerk pleading for their life, we might suppose. So the other theory is called the emotional impairment theory. And according to this theory, the problem that psychopaths face is one related to emotional response. So the idea is that, I mean, there are certain kinds of differences in psychopath physiology and psychology that we've noticed. They have a reduced autonomic response to pain and distress of others. They have reduced recognition of emotional responses, and also reduced aversive conditioning. That is, they lack the risk aversion that other people have, where if they're punished in some way, then this leads them to reform their behavior. This isn't true of psychopaths as much. They don't reform their behavior in light of being punished. So an original thought here was that punishment processing is dysfunctional while rewarding processing is intact or even enhanced. So psychopaths maybe are drawn more towards rewards that they could get and don't fail to notice the kind of punishment that they would receive. And also a thought is that perhaps psychopaths are dysfunctional when it comes to, or have a disorder when it comes to perceiving or responding to the emotional responses of others in an appropriate way. So one thought here is that we and other kinds of social animals probably have in our brains a kind of violence inhibition mechanism. So the idea behind this, ethologists suggest, that's people who study animals, they suggest that there's an existence of these mechanisms that control aggression in some social animals. So the idea is, like, if you have a dog that's like viciously attacking another dog, and the other dog exhibits some distress behavior, then the first dog will calm down and will stop attacking, okay? So this is a violence inhibition mechanism. So the idea is that when we're faced with these kinds of like sad, subservient responses, it triggers this kind of mechanism in this like social animal's brain, this dog's brain, such that he stops aggressing. And the thought is that there may be something similar to humans. So this researcher, Blair, a British researcher, I forget his first name right now, but he's one of the main people who has looked into psychopathy. He argues that humans might possess a kind of functionally analogous violence inhibition mechanism to these dogs. So, right. So the thought is that if humans are being aggressive and they observe some facial response of someone who's terrified, I think this is actually from Jurassic Park, then they will, in that case, stop and respond with a kind of calm response. In fact, there's been some kind of evidence for this. So in a 1977 study, Kamras observed that the display of distress cues, a sad face, facial expression, does actually result in the termination of aggression in 4 to 7-year-olds. So it seems like, at least innate to us, there is this kind of mechanism that stops aggression in us. And the assumption here is that distress cues activate predispositions to withdraw in any observer who processes them, regardless of whether that observer is the aggressor or a bystander. But this doesn't imply that the final behavioral response of all observers who process a victim's distress cues are the same. The activation of VIM, or this violence inhibition mechanism, in any observer will predispose him or her to withdraw from the situation. And then it's also thought that the strength of the withdrawal response is assumed to be a function of the degree of activation of the violence inhibition mechanism. So an isolated sad facial expression may excite limited withdrawal. A screaming, sobbing individual may excite much greater withdrawal. And then the thought is that this activation of the violence inhibition mechanism is experienced as aversive or unpleasant, something we don't like, and that's what causes us to stop what we're doing. But the thought is that perhaps psychopaths lack this capacity. They don't actually have this kind of violence inhibition mechanism due to neurological deficits or differences, and that leads them not to have their violence inhibited when their victims are responding in negative ways. Now, the problem with psychopaths is that they're less than 1% of the population, but they commit, it's estimated, over 40% of violent crime. So both of these are estimates, but there's reason to think this is the case. About 1% of the prison population fails the psychopathy test. That is, they display evidence of antisocial personality behavior. And these criminals that do this are responsible for about 40% of the violent crime in the system. But whatever the explanation of their disorder, it seems clear that morality doesn't have the same significance to them, that they just can't understand it. Their brains are different from ours in some way. So if that's the case, they don't actually understand morality, then how can they be held legally or morally responsible? So what is the response that we need to give to the psychopath, who is maybe the best example of someone with an abnormal brain who, as a result of that, responds in these negative ways? And if these psychopaths aren't held responsible, then what should we do with them? So this problem about how to treat people who commit violent crimes because of in ways that seem to be influenced by mental or brain disorders, mental disorders, what do we do with them? That problem is exacerbated with the psychopaths, who are our most violent criminals, but who clearly are acting out of a kind of abnormal psyche in some way that's not their fault. I mean, I should add here that we know that like psychopathy is very heritable, right? So it seems to have a strong genetic component, again, which pushes to this idea that it's not a kind of choice in some way. Okay, so let's pull back a little bit from the psychopaths and just think again about brain differences and punishment, right? So I think the question again that I want you to think about is, how appropriate is it to punish people with brain disorders for their crimes? And should we mitigate sentencing for such disorders? And then on the other hand, I think, a real response to this is, should people be let off the hook just because their brains are different, right? And where do we want to draw the distinction? Which brain disorders are mitigating? As I suggested, if we're good physicalists, we believe that everything we do is the result of some factor about our brains. So shouldn't any criminal have just as much right to claim that their brain is exculpating and that it allows them to avoid punishment? Okay. I'm going to turn now to discuss the podcast briefly. So the podcast looks at the same question, biology and moral responsibility. In the podcast, we're presented with Robert Sapolsky, this neuroscientist, who discusses Kevin, a person who committed these, what he did was he essentially possessed child pornography on his work computer, and he inappropriately propositioned some nurses at a facility where he was being held. He acted in these ways that were very unusual, and it turned out that this was due to the fact that there was a tumor in his brain that was causing him to act in this way. So Robert Sapolsky thinks it's incredible. He thinks it's terrible that Kevin was held legally responsible, that is appalling. He thinks that Kevin should not have been held legally responsible at all. So he asks, why does Kevin look at child pornography at home and not at work? Or rather, this is a question that people ask in suggesting that he's morally responsible, right? That he looks at the stuff at home and not at work, and that shows, right, that he acts irresponsibly. Or that he knows that it's bad to do what he's doing, right? But Sapolsky points out that he, clearly he wouldn't have this inclination at all if not for the damage to his frontal lobe, right? He has an inclination to look at child pornography or to behave in these inappropriate ways because of damage to his frontal lobe. And if he didn't have that damage, then he wouldn't do it, right? So the thought is, like, according to Sapolsky, he was able to check it to stop doing this at work, but that was just because of fear, right? And in the day, because cognitive resources are high, right? But we know that people, and this comes up in the article as well, as the day goes on, their cognitive resources are depleted. So we looked at in the evening, of course, right? But that's because, his cognitive resources had been depleted at that point. He was under cognitive load, and he was unable to resist the desire that would not have been there, everyone agrees, if he did not have this tumor. And then also at work, he was fearful of what might happen to him, of course. And so that also checked his behavior. But again, all of Sapolsky says, none of that mitigates the fact or changes the fact that he would not have been in this position at all if not for a kind of brain disorder. And Sapolsky thinks it's ridiculous for us to hold him responsible. right? Sapolsky points out that 500 years ago, we would have said the person who experiences an epileptic seizure is bad or rotten, right? We would have thought that that is evidence, actually, at least in European traditions, that's evidence that they are being punished by God, and the reason is that they have done something bad, right? So long ago in the past, our concepts of moral responsibility didn't give any breaks to people for any kind of biological difference. We know now that that's bullshit, and we don't think that's the case anymore. We don't think the people who experience epileptic seizures are bad or rotten people. We know it's just a kind of biological difference in them. Now, up to the 1950s, though, right, we did believe that many more things that we now think are the result of biology are due to moral transgression. So up into the 1950s, if your adolescent child started having hallucinations, the thought was that you are to blame for that you did that, right? We know now that that's due to biological underlying differences. And Sapolsky's thought is that this is just going to keep happening as science progresses, that all the things we thought were under our control and we could be blamed for are just going to get chalked up to biology. So Sapolsky thinks we need to, right now, just admit that this is the case, that everything is due either to heritability or to the kind of biological structure that you're dealing with, and just get rid of moral responsibility, get rid of the concept of moral responsibility, right? Going on, as science progresses, all of the things that we think are under our control, that we should control, and if we don't, we can be blamed for, all of those things are going to be chalked up to screw-ups in our biology that we couldn't have controlled if we wanted to. So we face a choice then, either ban all future findings pertinent to an area of criminal and moral responsibility, or else accept that free will is just the biology that we haven't learned, and that eventually this concept will go away. And if free will goes away, then so does moral responsibility. And if that's the case, then what is our justification for punishment? So this is all covered in the podcast. I think we should talk about this more. I think it's an interesting point for us to end on this term. So let's bring it up in Q&A this week. Why don't you write some questions around it, okay? All right. Last point on today's tour of cognitive science and legal responsibility. Well, second to last point, actually. So I want to end here, or I want to begin a discussion of some of the more general challenges to our legal system that Eagleman, in the article that you read, proposes based on our understanding of psychology, right? And I'm going to start here by reading a quote from Tom Bingham, Britain's former senior law lord. And this person is mentioned in the article. So what he writes is, in the past, the law has tended to base its approach on a series of rather crude working assumptions. Adults of competent mental capacity are free to choose whether they will act in one way or another. These are the assumptions. They are presumed to act rationally and in what they conceive to be their own best interest. They are credited with such foresight of the consequences of their actions as reasonable people in their position could ordinarily be expected to have, and they're generally taken to mean what they say. Now, whatever the merits, Bingham goes on, or demerits of working assumptions such as these in the ordinary range of cases, it is evident that they do not provide a uniformly accurate guide to human behavior. So these assumptions that our laws, our legal system is based on, we know now, right? That legal system is several hundred years old. It's based off of English common law, and then developed in a variety of different contractual governing documents that America and the West has agreed to. All that stuff is based on these assumptions, but it's hundreds of years later since this kind of this legal system that we're dealing in started to develop, and many of those assumptions about human psychology we now know to be incorrect, right? So we're still dealing with this law system that is based on an inaccurate view of human beings, right? And so what should we do about that? Some other points to bring this home, right? The entire legal process, right? This is the point, is structured on a number of assumptions that are challenged by the science of the mind. And here are two more, right? We assume that witness testimony is accurate, right? It's regarded as the most important evidence by jurors. Yet it is, in fact, probably the most inaccurate of evidence, right? There's problems with memory and perception that we can point to, and so on. So witness testimony is, as a matter of fact, one of the most influential factors for jurors. But there are so many problems with it that that makes our reliance on this testimony problematic in its own sense. Additionally, we have an assumption that the legal system is impartial, right? That justice is impartial. Think about the statue of justice who's wearing a blindfold. We think justice is blind. But in fact, cognitive science teaches us that there are implicit biases related to race, gender, socioeconomic status, and so on at every level of the legal system, right? People of minority races are charged more often for crimes. Their crimes when they have the same priors or their punishments when they have the same priors and the same background are more severe than people of different races, right? So we know that our legal system is not impartial. And we know that the reason it's not is because of these implicit biases that are the result of heuristics relying upon the cognitive science studies. So these assumptions of the law are, in fact, challenged by the science of the mind. And what does that suggest? Doesn't that suggest that we should maybe revise our legal system in light of what we now know about the mind? Well, this is where, in effect, Eagleman ends. So he offers some concrete suggestions for reforming our legal system, and we'll just quickly discuss these. So what are Eagleman's proposals for reform? So he says scientific insights into the brain will allow us to stop treating prison as a one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, prison needs to exist to deter those with normal brains. And I think here the question still is, what is a normal brain? How are you going to draw that distinction, buddy? So I think that's a real point to ask him about. But we also need more general modifications, he goes on, to the legal system to accommodate those with brain abnormalities, right? So given the fact that many of the people in the legal system are people with poor impulse control, he suggests that we need swifter, more certain punishments for parole violations. This may be surprising to some of you that he suggests this, but this is just what makes good sense for someone who is suffering from poor impulse control. He also suggests that we need more cops. This is written a while ago. I don't know where Eagleman would stand on this right now. And he also argues that we need new forms of treatment, right? So he suggests biofeedback techniques for modulating desires, and these be sort of encouraged that prisoners take part or criminals take part in biofeedback technique training, right? In this training, essentially, the idea is that you are able to adjust your desires for things by, if you're hooked up to maybe an EEG cap that's reading your brain waves, and that has a kind of craving bar represented on a screen, when you're presented with things you're interested in, you try to direct and make the craving bar go down, even being presented with those things. And in this way, people can learn how to control their desires and can actually develop more impulse control through biofeedback techniques. So that's the end for today. I think you'll really enjoy listening to both the podcast and reading this article, and I encourage you to do that sooner rather than later. The other reading for this week is also a popular piece reading by Paul Bloom, the psychologist, and it's looking at why do people have spiritual or religious beliefs? And so I'll make a short video for that tomorrow, so keep an eye out for it. And I look forward to seeing you this week for our last week in Introduction to Cognitive Science. Have a good night. Goodbye.